All right, welcome back to CS-289. This week we're going to play around with some advanced configurations of Apache. We will do some compatible features in IIS, but I think the concentration this week is some of the kind of cool, kind of crazy features that you can get into with Apache and its built-in modules that we can just configure in. So remember from last week that Apache's configuration mainly had to do with the text file httpd.conf. And everything we do in that particular file is just a text file that we need to alter for the different features or the different options that we actually have to set. We can always use some other configuration file, but we have to manually specify to Apache CTL to use this other file that we want to use. Otherwise, without any specific options, Apache CTL is just going to use your main httpd.conf file that would normally be in the default location. So the big idea with that configuration file is oftentimes it's a really, really, really large file. I think the first time that you opened that up and looked at the configuration, the amount of comments was great for learning what the directives does in that configuration file, but it was also made the file really unruly that in order to get to the features you wanted to play around with, you had to do a lot of scrolling. And in a command line environment, scrolling through just is not all that great of an option in order to get to the section that you want to actually see. So oftentimes what we do is we'll just recreate the file. I like to keep a backup of the original, create a new one, and delete everything except for the required directives that I want for that particular configuration. Other alternative methods include breaking up that particular file into multiple smaller files and using a include or include optional directive pointing to the file path for another configuration file to load in addition to any directives in that main file. For a lot of configurations on operating systems with the Apache package, this is actually what they end up doing is they will put configuration files in random places in the file system. It's not really random, but files that made sense to the operating system people, where to put configuration files. And then in the main configuration file, the main httpd.conf, all they do is specify includes and the path to where you get those particular files in the file system elsewhere. So it's a one small configuration file that says, hey, load that file, load that file, load that file. And those particular files can be in whatever other directory, which would need to be configured for their particular settings. Oftentimes, it's the main httpd.conf file will point to individual configuration files for multiple websites that they have set up. So they have a configuration file for client A, configuration file for client B, so on and so forth. And that way it makes management a little bit easier. If client B is no longer with you, you go through and comment out the include for client B and then add client D and E at the same time. And that way, each of the client configuration files are not overlapping each other, and yet still have configurations that are specific to each individual client that you might be hosting for. In the configuration file, remember that your directives are placed in one of four contexts. Either it's going to configure the server itself, it's going to configure a virtual host. Remember that's how you host multiple websites in one particular server, is create a virtual host configuration and include the appropriate directives therein. Or it's going to be a directive specifically meant for a directory, a file, or a specific location meaning a URL that is given to the server. There's also a special file called htaccess, which can be placed in the file system at any path that is part of the web server's content, and that htaccess.htaccess file will contain directives that could modify the behavior just for that one particular directory, or depending on what's in the .htaccess file, options for a particular file in that particular directory. The nice thing about .htaccess is you don't have to be an administrator to upload a .htaccess file, that anyone who can upload any content can configure that particular file and upload it as part of regular content. And that's one way that users are able to manage some of their settings, as long as the administrator has deemed that they can follow some of the directives available in the htaccess files that are uploaded by the content creators. Remember that some of these directives are only valid in specific contexts, that they need to be placed in the correct path or the correct container in order for those options to actually have any effect. There's a link there for the documentation, and inside the documentation it tells you, it should indicate which context that particular command is available or would be followed in. So a directory container really affects the specified directory that is part of the original opening bracket there, and all of the subdirectories inside of that particular directory. So opening tag is, directory, put a space, and then put a Unix or Linux file path to specify the name of the directory, starting with the root directory in through any of the folders, subfolders, and finally the containing folder. When Apache has to traverse to this particular directory in order to serve up content, then it will also, as long as it's in a directory or subdirectory of this particular path, it will also pick up the options that are part of that particular configuration. You can use your wildcard characters, the asterisk or the question mark. Remember, the asterisk is one or multiple characters, and question mark is 0 or 1 character. And so you can make options for any type of directory that would meet that particular wildcard. File container works the same way, except you specify a particular file or a wildcard of files. So it works pretty much the same way as the directory, just that when you call a specific file that matches the wildcard, or a specific file that matches the path and the name, that is the only time that those options would kick in. It's really meant for if you have specific files that you want to have custom permissions or custom options that are not superseded by the directory container where you want to use the files container. So this goes into our inheritance and our hierarchy, that the defaults at the higher level can be overridden by settings at the directory or even the specific file level as you go down the context there. So in nesting, and this kind of makes sense, that you can have a files container inside of a directory container, but you cannot put a directory container inside of a files container. I think that sort of makes sense. But also, you cannot have a directory container inside of another directory container. Instead, you specify a whole new directory container that points to a subdirectory of a previous directory container. So just like in, I believe, HTML or other XML type coding, you really should close your container before you start a new container and just specify different path or different directory, different file for where you want these set of rules to take place. Likewise, you cannot have a files container nested inside of another file container there as well. The htaccess file I mentioned can be uploaded by content creators. As the admin, though, you have to put the allow override directive inside of a directory container saying that the directories contained within whatever path that you're going to provide, if they have a .htaccess file, go ahead and use the options that are contained in that .htaccess file. That you have to specify that it is okay to do that. The good part about using htaccess, again, is that it means content creators can create their own options and permissions for files inside of their content. But it does mean a little bit of a slower performance hit on Apache, because every single time Apache has to traverse a directory in order to find content, it needs to first check if there's an htaccess file. And then if there is one, it needs to process any of the directories, any of the options in those particular directories as it searches for the file content in question. So it's good. It's a good option. It's modular, especially for content creators, but just know that it does mean a little bit of a performance hit, as Apache needs to check every single directory to make sure that there isn't a htaccess file that it needs to append additional options or directives in as it goes through. Specific options that often will be part of each of these containers, either directories or files or even htaccesses, typically include this set here. The most common includes are going to be options indexes and follow symlinks. Follow symlinks essentially allows Apache to follow Linux symbolic links as if they were real paths and real files. So if you have a symbolic link to a folder that is in some completely different drive or some completely different path on a Linux file system, it will still follow that path and include it as a additional subdirectory in a standard URL being provided to the web server. Indexes, I mentioned a little bit last week. Indexes is the option to allow Apache to return a listing of all the files in that particular directory if, number one, a generic or general URL was requested, and number two, a default document was not found in that one particular directory. So those are the most common options that we typically allow. So other options include exec CGI for really old command line scripts that you would use on a Linux system. It's not really used anymore, so we don't really allow that. Includes and includes no exec are again some older server side includes. This is a sort of precursor to any scripting language that we currently have now. Again, not common nowadays, and so we don't normally leave that in there. Same thing with symlinks. If owner matches, that is a specific situation where a user has logged in or authenticated themselves, and the Apache user can determine whether or not the person requesting that path has authenticated correctly and is allowed access to those particular subdirectories or symlinks as subdirectories in a particular folder. So those are the standard, options that we pretty much have or that we pretty much include for most of our directories there. Remember, if we set this at a server level, then that will be the default for any content in that particular server or any content in that particular directory. If you do it at a high enough directory level, we don't have to override it at a lower level, but we can choose to disable. We can do an options none at a lower level if we want to stop these options from taking hold. Right? That's the whole idea of inheritance there as well. So unless a child has their own options set that they will just use the same options and permissions and privileges as the container that they were installed inside of previously. You can do things like use a plus or a minus to inherit the basic settings, but also add or also remove these particular settings there as well. So the example there is you'll include the options directive, you'll include an includes to include the option for server side includes, but you'll also subtract the idea of indexes, so you're not displaying a list of files in any one particular directory. A location container is similar to directory and files, but instead of referring to a specific path on the Linux file system, instead they're looking at a path in the requested URL that's coming from the client. So if we do something like a location status or /status, then the location container there, Apache will look at that particular request and map that request to a specific option or a specific, in this case, a specific handler, which is a built-in script that comes with Apache to give it'll run a script and give some information back about the instance of Apache that's currently running. So again, locations similar to directory and files, but instead works on the requested client URL and not on any particular file system or path inside of Linux itself. And so those are the some of the new features that we'll be playing around with inside of Apache. We'll introduce a few more tips and tricks there as well. In IIS, the comparisons are going to be the server sites site, any directories or virtual directories, and any files contained there within. So in IIS, you at least have the convenience of a graphical view where you can see individual items nested inside of each other, and the inheritance there still follows along. Anything at a higher or left-er level will automatically provide defaults for anything in a lower or right-er level. So you can kind of see graphically how the inheritance would take place. Into a file-specific property, you're going to have to toggle back and forth between directory view and content view. So you'll have to get to the directory in question. At the bottom of the screen in IIS, there should be a content view button. It will switch it to showing you the file's content to that particular directory. After that, you right-click on the particular file, go to Properties, and then go back to not content view, but directory view, and it should show the specific features that you can enable or disable for that one particular file. In IIS, we don't normally play around or add specific features to individual files, so that's their reasoning for hiding that particular setting in IIS. In Apache, we had the .htaccess file. In IIS, we're going to use a web.config file. Very similar idea, but it's not a direct match. That in .htaccess, it's just a standard text file with directives placed into it. In web.config, it is a XML file structure, and you'll need to know a few more options, settings in order to properly write down or properly configure the XML file. Oftentimes, this is used by like .NET IDE integrated development environments to create specific permissions to files. And so if you create a .NET application and upload it to a IIS server, oftentimes the web.config file will come in with that configuration or with that content to set appropriate permissions for that .NET application. right? And same thing in IIS, you can always add or disable features and properties at a lower level, even if they were automatically set at the higher level in any of your content there within. Some more interesting pieces for Apache. There are ways of adding additional features, typically in the form of modules. And there's a link there for the number of modules available for the version of Apache that we're using. There are lots and lots and lots of different modules that we'll be using for not just searching for content, but also for authentication and for administration that we'll look at in the weeks to come. In order for Apache to use these modules, they need to be loaded in the initial configuration, meaning the httpd.conf file. As you looked through that particular file, you've probably went through that section where there's a whole bunch of load module commands. And the method of using that is to use a load module line. It's the directive, followed by the name of the module, followed by the path to the module file coming from the installed Apache root. Like where Apache is installed into, there should be a modules folder. In this specific example here, the info module is the module we're going to try and load, and that module should be installed or should be found in the modules folder as a file named mod_info.so, and that is the compiled version of the module meant to be used for that particular Apache configuration. If you're going to load new modules, then you're going to have to either uncomment if the line is already in httpd.conf, or write in your own new load module line for that particular configuration file. Keep in mind, check the documentation. Not all modules are version compatible with each version of Apache. Most of the popular ones are going to be, but not every single module is going to be compatible. You may need to find a new module, a new version of the module, or a different solution to a feature that you were looking for. Some examples is the mod_spelling. Notice anything about the name of this particular module? Well, it's misspelled. So this does deal with spelling errors as part of a URL directory path. Remember, the difficulty in Linux too, or also, is that capitalization does matter. So the spelling module can help to alleviate either if you've accidentally misspelled a directory path or accidentally left out a capitalization or put in a capitalization for individual files or directories that you're looking for. So the load module is going to be spelling module, and then the actual module file itself is going to be in the modules directory named mod_spelling.so. So that first bullet point there should be one whole line. It doesn't fit on the screen as one line, but it should be one line. The directives that are added by loading in this module are the check spelling. Notice that check spelling is spelled correctly. So check spelling should be on, and check case only can be on there as well. If you do check case only, then it will only check for capitalization. It won't check for transpositions like TEH and THE for common misspellings of words there as well. Another module is the alias module. So here's a way of, if they've requested one particular path or one particular URL, you can actually redirect them to a different location. So from the module documentation there as well, the load module again should be one line. Once that module is loaded, then you have additional directives that get added. The directive for aliasing is just the alias directive. So when a client requests anything with image, then you're going to actually Apache is actually going to try and pull from the path named root FTP pub image. So it's sort of a redirection or a hidden redirection on the back end of things, that you can put your images in a completely different directory, even if the client requests something that is /image, it will find it in the requested directory there as well, instead of just image. And then a redirect, kind of like you played around with in Module 2, we looked at how Google redirects you from google.com to www.google.com. This is the redirection that we can set up in Apache. The redirect directive says that if anyone requests 103, well, then instead repoint them to example.com.etc. So this is just a, what are they requesting? If they request this particular URL, then here's where you should redirect them to. The next module is deflate. Just from its name, what do you suppose this particular module does? How could you find out? I've already given you some pointers to the documentation for previous modules. So in that particular area as well, you can find documentation for the deflate module. My guess is it has something to do with compression, and you load it up with some sort of load module command, and that should enable some directives that you can specify in the httpd.conf file there as well. So make sure you check the documentation for that to find the specifics. For comparisons to IIS, there is not the same number of modules typically available for IIS. Generally, they're first-party only modules given by Microsoft. There are a few third-party ones. The third-party ones are usually the, hey, until Microsoft gets their act together and creates a first-party module, you can use this one instead. And then, a couple of years go by and Microsoft says, hey, that's a good idea. We should really take that idea and actually develop a fully supported and first-party module for it. So eventually, most features do get added into IIS that someone has generally taken the time to go ahead and create. In IIS, we'll typically download those from the IIS.net site. In the server manager for IIS, you go into role services, and you can typically add additional features that may not have been included in the first time that we installed IIS. In either of those methods, either installing it from a download or installing it from role services, should add the appropriate icons inside of IIS Manager. And we'll take a look at that inside of labs there as well. So IIS modules, typically there's a link here to where to find some typical IIS modules. Most of the time they're Microsoft specific, like the module to load ASP or ASP.NET support. Content compression. Gee, that sounds kind of familiar. I wonder if it's related to the deflate module in Apache there. And the URL rewrite extension. Gee, that sounds familiar too. I wonder if that's related to the redirect extension there in Apache. So the idea of being able to do the same or similar actions in each operating system should be one of the features here. Not every single module you'll be able to recreate in one platform or another. For example, you should not, or at least have not, been able to run .NET applications on Apache, and typically you're not going to be running Linux applications on the IIS side of things. So while they each have their individual features, they're still compatible in that both platforms can serve content, and for the most part can serve up most of the same content to each of your clients. So in lab this week, you'll play around with enabling and installing individual modules. Play around with the spelling module. Just how far off can you get before the spelling module no longer can figure out which content you're trying to get to for your particular Apache content, things like that. All right. That's it for this particular module, relatively short compared to other weeks. Any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, go ahead and get started on lab and come find me on Thursday during class time if you have further questions or want me to take a look at stuff. All right, have a good week. I will talk to you later.